I want to welcome you to Big Rapids, the Ferris State University, and again, this great conference now in its 18th year. We're delighted to have you here. We're delighted that the conference has chosen to come back to Big Rapids. For me, this is my first time being here for the conference, though it was a few years ago. I understand that it was in Big Rapids at Ferris State. So we're delighted that you're back. Thank you for coming out today. I think we're all glad to be inside. There's not a lot of incentive to be outside today. Those of you from the UP, we share your concern and pain about going back to snow, it sounds like. Just a few housekeeping things this morning. First and foremost is we have had to change the schedule of the speakers, the keynote speakers this morning. Paul Loeb, who was scheduled to be here this morning, who I have to speak quietly, is resting. He got in about 3 o'clock last night, 3 a.m. this morning, I should say. He got delayed in Chicago at O'Hare. So the flip side of that is that we have a very generous and accommodating keynote speaker this morning, Melissa Lacewell Harris, who has kindly adjusted her schedule to be able to be on this morning. So thank you, Melissa, for doing that. I do think, at least for the moment, that's the only change in the schedule that I know of. Paul will be up and at it for his 10:30 session this morning, and then he'll do the keynote at noon. So I want to introduce first President David Eisler from Ferris State, our president of Ferris State University.
Thank you, Todd. Welcome to Ferris State University. We're delighted to have you here with us today, and I'd like everyone who's been involved with creating this conference, planning this conference, to stand up so we can say thank you. All the people on the steering committee who helped plan this, please stand up so we can say thank you to you. Equity in the classroom. What a wonderful idea. Let's think about that again. Equity in the classroom. And we have this wonderful opportunity as faculty, as universities, to help change the lives of people. To do that in an environment where everyone is equal is a wonderful thing to seek. A wonderful thing to seek. Now, Jim and Rudy, I know this conference goes from place to place, but I want you to know that we want you to come to Ferris State University as often as you possibly can, because we have a home for you here, and I think you can see by the number of people who are from Ferris today that we really do support this for you. So thank you so very, very much. These are great times for us at Ferris as we work with our first university-wide diversity plan, and we think about how we make our university the type of place that everyone is welcome and wants to come to. We're fortunate at Ferris that we take a lot of what we see for our university from our founder. We're the one state public university that recognizes regularly its founder. We know our founder. It's part of our name. And Woodbridge Ferris said the purpose of Ferris State University was to make the world a better place. I hope you'll join us in that. We look forward to the next day and a half together. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, President Eisler. I'd also like to introduce to you Jim Fulkening. Jim is here from Lansing. He is the director of the office that has brought equity in the classroom to the universities across the state now for 18 years. So let me introduce Jim.
Thank you, Todd. I want to welcome you this morning to this 18th workshop. We have been very pleased over the years to have within the Office of Post-Secondary Services the King Chevis Parks Initiative and the great staff that we have in that particular program area. I know many of you over the years have met with the staff, and you relate with them very well, and they really consider you friends. The Post-Secondary Services is now part of a brand new bureau within the Department of Labor and Economic Growth called the Bureau of Workforce Transformation. So in new correspondence that you see coming out, you'll see a little bit of a change. The work that we're doing now in the Bureau gives us a renewed appreciation of the opportunity we have to again co-sponsor this conference along with our partners, all the 15 universities and the private colleges within our state. We value our fine association partnership that's been very important to us and to those clients and individuals that we serve. The theme chosen for the conference, inclusion, leadership in the classroom, making the connection. It couldn't be more relevant or more timely than it is today. After all, Michigan's economy and its future depends upon an educated and diverse workforce. For us to effectively compete in this global economy, we felt it all so strongly, especially the last several years. And that largely depended on strong schools, strong educators, and most importantly, strong connections with our students. To increase the enrollment, retention, and graduation of students who are underrepresented in our colleges and universities is a common goal that we share with you, since we all are only an office in state government. You really are the implementers for us throughout the colleges and universities. I want to thank our gracious host, President Eisler and Ferris State University. We do appreciate the offer to come back again, and I'm sure that in the near future we will take you up on that, as well as the planning committee. Over the next 2 days, you will hear from 3 outstanding nationally recognized individuals who are authors, scholars, and researchers. And as last night's opening theme, it will allow us to think, to question, and to challenge each other. I want to invite those speakers to Michigan and hope that they have a chance to really get an exchange with our various staff members as well. I want to thank all the delegation and coordinators of this particular conference for all their hard work, especially Sherry Lay and her staff. Sherry was in here earlier. She was the one who graciously checked us all in. Thank you, Sherry. And in closing, I'd like to say how much we appreciate you and continue the work that you are doing on your campuses. And together as colleagues, we can increase post-secondary opportunities for those underrepresented students in Michigan. Thank you, and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Jim. Anybody have any questions, comments? Anything y'all need to bring to the fore this morning before we begin? Great. Well, thanks again, everybody. I have one last introduction, and that is Mr. Ron Sneed. Ron is a member of Ferris State University's Board of Trustees, and Ron has graciously made a trip up this morning to be a part of the Equity in the Classroom Conference. Again, another indication of the importance that diversity, equity, and inclusion has to the state of Michigan and to Ferris State. And so Mr. Sneed, Trustee Sneed.
Good morning, and again, welcome to Big Rapids. For you U of M delegates, Dr. Matlock and I graduated from here a few years ago. It is my honor to introduce a tremendous speaker. It's exciting for me. You've got her small bio in our handout, and I don't want to go through all of it for you because we're all excited to hear what she has to say. But Professor Melissa Harris-Lacewell is the Associate Professor of Politics and African American Studies at Princeton University. She received her BA in English from Wake Forest University, her PhD in Political Science from Duke University, and an honorary doctorate from Meadville Lombard Theological School. And she also is a student presently at Union Technological Seminary. She's a dynamic speaker, as you will find out shortly, and the proud mother of Parker. Please welcome Melissa Lacewell. Thank you.
have to stand down here because I've got to have proximity to my technology here. But hopefully, even in the back, you'll be able to see me. And I could always run up and jump up if you need a little visual stuff. Okay, so today, I meant to be speaking this afternoon at lunch, so this is a little bit earlier than I planned to be here, but since I was already well ensconced here in Michigan, back in the Midwest, which is lovely. I spent 7 years at the University of Chicago before going to Princeton, and I actually very much love the Midwest and the nature of the Midwest, how people are here. The East Coast, while a lovely place, is not at all the same kind of friendly, warm, very actually southern space that the Midwest is. So having grown up in the South, I am very happy to be back in the Midwest today. And I want to talk today. Actually, what I want to do is just brag about my students. And I want to be clear that the bragging that I'm doing is very much about them, about the ways that my students have taught me over time to teach about race. Many of us show up in the classroom for the first time. In a college classroom, I started teaching in 1997 at North Carolina Central University when I was finishing my doctorate. And you show up with, I saw an eagle in the back. Oh, I see a couple. Okay, good. I started teaching at North Carolina Central with, very little preparation. They sort of put you into the classroom and said, go for it. And so it's been over that decade that my students have really taught me how to teach. And through a lot of error and a lot of experimentation, I just wanted to share with you a little bit the ways in which I've had an opportunity to think about engaging interracial conversation. So I know that this conference is much broader than just questions of race. We're also going to tackle gender, sexual identity, ethnicity, difference. But just for today, for this talk, I want to talk a bit about race in particular. And I want to start with this question of, why is race different? Why do we need a discussion about talking about race? I mean, isn't good pedagogy regardless of the topic, right? Should it make any difference whether you're teaching a political science course on race or whether you're teaching a chemistry course? In fact, actually, I would say those two are quite linked. But, what difference does it make? What kind of class you're teaching? And my claim is that race and the subject of race actually creates some very specific challenges in the classrooms, particularly if you're teaching in an interracial classroom about race. Although not exclusively, these same problems can occur, or these same challenges can crop up even in classrooms that are supposedly all of one race, but it turns out that there is no typical white person, typical black person, or typical Latino, right? So it turns out that, in fact, we end up with all kinds of challenges, even in classrooms that appear to be pretty homogenous. But specifically, I want to talk about the way that race affects why students end up in a class on race, what students hear and see in that classroom, what students think, and what they feel. Right? Because in each of these areas, it impacts how we as professors, as teachers, are engaging with them, right? So let me just start with this idea of why students end up in a class on race. It might seem obvious that students would end up in a class on race because they're fundamentally engaged with a sort of progressive politics that is interested in thinking about race broadly, challenging themselves, and showing up for the tough conversation. Has anybody experienced that it's always universally true that that's why your students are in a class on race? Yeah, right. Exactly. There are some students who are showing up for that reason, but there are also lots of students who perceive race classes as the easy courses, right? The courses where they will sort of fly through and not have to do the hard technical work as like a chemistry class, for example. There are students who show up in race courses because they think they already know all of the answers. This is particularly true, I have found, for my racially marginalized students who believe that their experience as a black or brown person in America is sufficient for information. They need not read the books written by black, brown, and white people because they have walked around on the planet in a black or brown body and therefore know everything, right? Now, what's important for me then is to start with the stories that students think they know, right? So for me, what I do is I start with the stories that students think they know. So let me walk through that a bit. We know that there are enormous perceptual gaps between the races on how we respond to and think about stimuli, right? Enormous perceptual gaps. So at this point, I'm not even talking about what we've processed cognitively or what we're feeling emotionally, just what we actually are seeing, right? Is this guy guilty or innocent? Now, black folks have kind of come over on this question over time, but there was a time when this was a huge sort of racial difference. Is this guy guilty or innocent? Is affirmative action a good or bad policy? Was this a good or a bad president? Is this a fun family movie for the holidays or a racist diatribe about black male sexuality's desire to possess white women so much so that you have to shoot them down in the middle of New York City in order to control black men? See Vogue cover this month. Has anybody seen the Vogue cover this month? LeBron James? Yeah, okay, right. So in other words, this might be, in fact, a fun family movie for the holidays for some folks, and for other folks, it's a lynching flick, right? And so even what seemed to be the most innocuous, right? The most innocuous perceptual stories, the things we think we know, right? This guy was president. He played the saxophone, right? This guy was the great president. This guy is guilty or innocent. This is a fun family movie. These seem like things that students would know, right? Just sort of basic perceptual realities. But it turns out that even at the core of our basic perceptual realities are these huge racial differences, gulfs even, I would say. Not just gaps, but gulfs across which we have to find some way to have a conversation. For example, students respond very differently to these three social facts. I often start my classes on race and disaster with these three social facts. White infants are 2.5 times more likely to live to the age of 1 than are black infants. I ask my students, is this a disaster, right? And students tend to say, it's a tragedy. You know, it's bad, we have to figure it out. It's obviously bad, but there must be good explanations, good reasons for this. Right? But black and white students, it turns out, respond very differently to this social fact. Men are vastly overrepresented at all levels of government, but most especially the US Congress, the American presidency, and the US Supreme Court. That's just true. Men are shockingly overrepresented. If we had an all-women Supreme Court for the next 100 years, we'd start to get gender balance, right? Across time. I know that's very disruptive. People are like, what? All women? Yes. In fact, how about all black women lesbians? How about that? Yes? Right. Get ourselves a little balance for the next 100 years, and we'll be free to go back to, okay, right. So turns out, right, students respond, male and female students respond to this with a sense of, well, that's not a disaster. That's not a tragedy. I mean, that's just sort of a historical reality, and don't worry, men can govern women, just as well. No big deal. Constitutional law is not really all that different given that it's been interpreted by men for most of American history, right? Except that then there are some students who go ballistic about this and look at their friends in the classroom, people who they thought that they knew and understood, and they'll say, what? Why aren't you offended by this, right? Why isn't this upsetting for you? So again, just putting up these social facts. And finally, in the past 20 years, the household income of the poorest 1/5 of Americans has declined in both real and adjusted dollars. Now again, especially when you tell a story like this at a place like Princeton, which is of course a pretty privileged place, although a very interesting kind of mix of privilege, because Princeton is a place that, because of its astonishing endowment, actually has no loans for any student. So every student who is admitted to Princeton is able to come on full financial aid. What that means is that some students are paying whatever the exorbitant, ridiculous tuition is there, and some students are paying nothing. So there is a great deal of privilege just by being a part of the classroom, but there's also enormous economic diversity in the classroom because of the nature of how wealth allows that to be possible. So you tell a story like this, and there's a group of students for whom, right, the notion of being in the lowest 1/5 is just beyond the pale. They can't even imagine quite what that looks like. What big difference does it make? And other students who have understood what it means to not be sure if you're going to have dinner at home when you get home after school. Right? And so again, these sort of basic facts, these sort of social facts that just look like things that we could talk about on a basic level end up resonating for students in a very real gut way. And as we start to figure out how we're responding to these, we start getting to the tough work of a conversation on race and politics. Now, because I teach politics classes, I'm always asking after I put up these kinds of social facts, well, how should the government respond? Obviously, in a sociology or an economics class, you might ask a different set of questions about those social facts, but as a political scientist, I'm always interested in government and policy. And generally, it sort of shows up in one of two variations. One, we should respond to racial differences with race-conscious policy, right? Policy that takes into account the ways in which historically we've had these structural differences between blacks and whites. Or, right, the other story is, no, we must have colorblind policy, that you can never fix or address racism by taking into account race. In fact, it turns out every time I'm in public space, except this sort of lovely public space, but anytime I'm out there in the much more difficult real world, and I talk about race, I always get a flood of emails from people who say, Professor Lacewell, you're a racist. And usually what they mean by you're a racist is you're talking about race, right? You're having a conversation about race, and a conversation about it constitutes racism because what we should be doing is trying to, as much as possible, ignore race, right? So it turns out that when we start asking students, how should we address racial inequality, almost always, these are the two sort of pillars of thought that show up: race-conscious policy versus colorblind policy. And people start getting mad, hurt. I mean, really fundamentally in their gut. You watch particularly freshmen and sophomore women of color, is what I've noticed in terms of patterns, will go silent, right? They will have been talking, they will have been actively part of class, and then someone will make one of these two agreement or arguments that they don't want made, and particularly young women of color go silent. You can just see them kind of seething with the anger about the other position. Or the other group of people that goes silent are the young white men in class who feel like, okay, in my position of privilege, in this body, I now can't talk on this because if I do, I will be the one labeled racist, right? So pretty soon this sort of engaging conversation we're having, everybody's smart and interested and done the reading because it's the first week, right? And then it goes silent, right? Yeah, you have to, I'm gonna show you how I get them to stay awake later, right? Okay, so what I then try to do is say, okay, rather than immediately arguing about whether or not race-conscious or colorblind policies are sort of best suited for addressing our questions of racial inequality, let's start with the assumption that everyone in the classroom would like to end racial inequality, right? That maybe there is some group of people, I call them the naked racist out there in the world, who would like to promote and increase racial inequality. Okay, even if you're in my classroom, if you want to promote and increase racial inequality, there's really very little I can do for you. So off you go, right? But let's start with the assumption that everybody else in the room is on a good faith effort interested in reducing racial inequality, but that we have different notions about the appropriate strategies necessary for doing so. How might we have gotten to those different ideas? All right, so that's Bill Cosby, in case you don't see him. All right, and I want to suggest that there are sort of three different ways that we might think about how we get there. One is the notion that race is a result, and racial inequality is a result of intentional racist action. I think it's incredibly important to take a moment in classrooms to talk about intentional racism. I think it's easy for us to just sort of walk past this and say, well, there was a time when there was intentional racism, but there's not anymore, right? And instead say, okay, let's take this as a possibility. What does it mean if you think that racial inequality results from intentional racist actions? I tend to, on this particular lecture, spend a lot of time with lynching photographs and a lot of time with discussions of the prison industrial complex. Not because I think that they are essentially the same. In fact, I don't, and it's one of the first important things I talk about in class is you're never allowed to say in my class, ain't nothing changed. Particularly if you're 19 years old, you are not allowed to say in my class, ain't nothing changed. Because I say, well, come on now. My father grew up in Jim Crow Richmond. I mean, things may not be perfect, but things are different, right? Let's just go with things are different, which is why we do the lynching discussion, right? To talk about what is lynching, right? What is that experience? And we spend a lot of time talking about the photographs. For the students, when we do lynching photographs over and over again, it turns out they are not most appalled by the images of the victims. If you all have seen, for example, the Without Sanctuary, what do you think they most respond to? Not the images of the victims, but the spectators who are not hooded, who are not covered under the darkness of night, but who are smiling and looking at the camera and standing next to their children in great large groups. And for many students, it is the images of the spectators of the lynchings where they go, oh, okay, right? And so we spend a lot of time with the lynching photographs, both as a way to talk about how structural racism is real with a capital R, right? Intentional racist action, but also, right, to both make comparisons and contrasts next to the prison industrial complex, which we then talk about and show images of, and say, how are these things similar, but also, very importantly, how are they different, right? To think about change over time, not always progress. I know that Brother Barack tells us that the arc of history is long and always bends towards justice. Because he's fundamentally an optimist. I do believe that the arc of history is long. I am not completely certain that it always bends towards justice. I suspect it's much more, I'm the mother of a 6-year-old, it's much more like a chutes and ladders game. Sometimes you're flying up the ladder, everything's going good, you know, and then whoop, right back down the chute, right? So I suspect the arc of history may be something more like a chutes and ladders game, but okay, I got it, right? So we do try to talk about how things are different, right? How things are different, but to really try to engage the notion of intentional racist action. But also to point out that to talk exclusively about the idea of intentional racist action is to miss the ways in which structures can create racial inequality even without racist intent on the part of the actors, right? So then we start talking about residential segregation and the ways in which residential segregation, which may have begun as a set of intentional racist policies, right, 50 years ago, can continue to create and propose and structure racial inequality, even if there's no one standing there at the real estate office, although shockingly, there's often someone standing there at the real estate office, but let's just say there was no one standing there at the real estate office, right, guiding you in one direction or another. It turns out that racial segregation still has these enormous impacts of creating racial inequality, even without intentional racist actions. And this is, as I'll talk about in a minute, in our Hurricane Katrina class, where we go to Kanye West saying, George Bush doesn't care about black people. Why? That's a story that the students know. Kanye West says in this sort of defining moment of the Hurricane Katrina crisis, George Bush doesn't care about black people. He's making a claim about the first, intentional racist action, right? But then I want to sort of push him and say, is it really about George Bush? Do we know if George Bush cares about black people? He seems to like Condi and Colin well enough. I don't know, right? So back up from that and say, could we have had these same racial inequality outcomes that we see in the context of Hurricane Katrina, even if George Bush cared about black people, right? What kinds of structures of federalism, right, of racial segregation, of residential differences, of environmental injustice, right? How can these structures have created the same, right, outcomes that we see even without intentional racist action? And then finally, we absolutely always have to deal with the Bill Cosby argument, right? The pull up your pants, stop listening to hip hop, name your kid Kimberly instead of Kenyatta argument, right? He promised us that if we did, everything would be okay, right? And the truth is, it turns out it is not just the non-racial minority students in the classroom who are very strong believers in the pathology argument. In fact, it's often the students from the most dire circumstances who have the strongest pathology arguments because they perceive and experience pathology in their personal lives. And they go, hey, look, people got to make better decisions, right? Racism may have been important at one point, but the key issue now are the choices that people make within the structures that we currently have, right? And so we have to also grapple with that. And hopefully, right, at each point, start providing both evidence for and against each of these arguments so that as we back up to this conversation about colorblind policies versus policies that take into account race, we know that part of how we come to that decision about whether or not we should be using colorblind or race-conscious policies has everything to do with our assumptions about whether it's intentional racist actions, structural inequality, or the pathology on the part of marginalized groups, which are the fundamental causal mechanisms behind our inequalities. Okay, so One of the ways we do this is starting with stories we know. Now, what this has meant for me over the course of the past year is that we talk about Barack Obama a lot in class, which, again, as a Chicagoan and as the University of Chicagoan in particular, is really no problem for me. I enjoy talking about Barack, and now he's given us, whatever you think about Barack's candidacy, he's given us this lovely speech, which all of us who study and think about race can now write about for the next 100 years. It's like, we had Souls of Black Folks, we got 100 years out of that. Now, we've got Barack's speech, we can get another 100 years, right, out of taking apart the parts of that speech. So just as a pure scholarly endeavor, I was so happy to see that speech happen, because now we have something wonderful to talk about in class, right? So one of the ways to address race, for me, these big, tough questions about what causes inequality, how do we feel about it, and particularly as a political scientist, how our government should respond, is to start with the stories that we know. And know probably should be in quotation marks here, because the whole point is the stories we think we know are just the stories we think we know. And that, in fact, every time you teach these stories that you think you know, your students will teach you more, and hopefully you'll teach them more about these stories. So, last year, for me, this meant teaching Katrina, which I did for 2 years. This year, it means teaching the elections. All right, so the big question is, how do we find vocabulary for having this conversation? I mean, one of the things that Barack was particularly good at in his recent speech was emphasizing the ways in which these perceptual gaps that I've talked about, these differences about race conscious versus colorblind policy, these distinctions between intentional, structural, and pathological results or causes of racial inequality, is that it creates a problem of vocabulary, right? It's even when we're all speaking the same mother tongue, and we're not even always doing that, right? But even if we are all speaking the same language, we're often not speaking the same language when it comes to questions of race. We have a difficulty in hearing one another across our vocabulary differences. So for me, it turns out that I think it's much better for us to have these conversations somewhere other than the classroom. That there's ways that the classroom setting, me standing up at the podium, the students busily looking at internet porn on their computers while I talk to them, right? Whatever it is they're doing, I have no idea. That there's these sorts of rules, especially for students who are really, trying hard. They want to give you the right answer, right? There is some right answer. It's somehow inside of your professorial head, and they want to get in there and give you the right answer so that you will give them positive feedback and everybody will feel good. And one of the things about conversations about race is that they really rarely feel good, even in interpersonal settings, right? They are almost always uncomfortable. Now, anybody who's ever parented a boy knows that if you want to get a boy to talk, the worst thing you can do is to sit him down, and this is literally, well, you don't even have to parent a boy. You might have, for example, just, married one, right? So the single worst way to get a boy to talk to you is to sit him down and say, we got to talk. I have some uncomfortable things I'd like to talk with you about, right? You want to talk to a boy, what do you do? What do you do when you want to talk to your son? You go outside with them. You take a walk, you ride a bike, you take a ride, you fish. This is why the men fish, right? And it turns out, right, if you get a boy engaged kinetically, physically, right, all of a sudden they'll start talking. They won't tell you everything. Some of what they will tell you will not be true. Girls will lie too, right? But it turns out that the kinetic work of moving around actually loosens up our capacity to have this conversation. Now, it turns out it's not just gendered, that it's true in uncomfortable situations for boys and for girls, for men and for women. And so by getting my students up and out of the classroom, engaged in kinetic physical activity, not just jumping jacks, but actually out there working on projects together, they start developing common vocabulary, which is related to the groups that they work in. So I want to give you 2 quick examples and show you a little bit about how this has worked and sort of what I see as my main pedagogy on race, which is getting out of the classroom. The first I want to talk to you about is my class, Disaster, Race, and American Politics, which is really a course about Hurricane Katrina. And the second is my course on the Introduction to African American Politics. And I'm going to go quickly so I can leave some time for questions here. The Katrina course, which I'll talk about much more in our later afternoon session and be happy to kind of discuss with you the ways in which this class operated. This was a class that I designed immediately after Katrina, in part because all of us in this country wanted to do something. I mean, everybody felt the need to do something. Psychologists packed up and went down and talked with survivors, right? Brad Pitt is down there building houses. I'm a professor. What do? I teach classes and I do research. So the best I could do was to teach classes and do research about Katrina, because that's pretty much my only skill set, right? So what I did in this class was to develop a way of trying to think about Hurricane Katrina as a lens through which we could understand everything about American politics, because I actually think it is. I think Hurricane Katrina was this moment and its aftermath in which we could understand everything there was to know about American politics. So we started by reading Their Eyes Were Watching God, right? And of course there is the hurricane at the end of that text, of Zora Neale Hurston's text, which tells us everything about the racial and gendered inequalities that emerge in the context of disaster. So the students could see that this was in fact already a literary trope before becoming a human reality. We started, after reading Their Eyes Were Watching God, we read Leon Litwack's Been in the Storm So Long about Reconstruction, a time that is supposedly a happy time, right? It's the end of slavery. And yet the story of Reconstruction and the forced diaspora post-Reconstruction, and particularly Litwack's take on how that forced diaspora out of Mississippi and Louisiana, right, linked up what happens post-Katrina with something that happens in the 1860s. We looked at the contemporary divide in racial public opinion and looked at survey research. We looked, of course, at the role of media in politics, federalism, right, the relationship between state, local, and national governments, urban politics, and particularly all of the good research around black mayors, which made for great fun talking about Ray Nagin, or Ray Ray, as we started to call him. And of course, the questions of civil society in American politics, right? What happens when it is civil society rather than government that responds? We talked about the casserole ladies, right? All of the lovely evangelical women in the state of Texas who over and over again in the work that we were doing, when survivors were talking about their negative experiences, they were talking about FEMA. When they were talking about their positive experiences, they were talking about the casserole ladies from Texas, right? And how is it that civil society sometimes has this capacity to respond? So everything you would want to know in a straight introduction to American government course, you can actually learn through the lens of a story you think you know. Hurricane Katrina. So we end up with 100 students in the classroom who think they already know it because they've been following it, right, in the newspaper and on the media. But in fact, we start saying, what would happen if you were a political scientist and you're watching the coverage of Katrina? How would it tell you everything you need to know about American politics? But the deal was that even after all of this good work in the classroom, it simply was not enough to have talked about Katrina. It was important. We'd read about it. We'd engaged it over nearly 15 weeks. In certain ways, our classroom knew more about Hurricane Katrina than any group of 100 people in the country, and yet it was not enough. So the students actually initiated a service learning trip to New Orleans. They spent a week doing daily 8-hour shifts gutting homes. And then every evening, we met with survivors, stakeholders, public policymakers, public officials in New Orleans. So we had been in the classroom, we had been struggling through these conversations, but ultimately what we found was we had to go. We had to get on the plane, we had to go, and we had to stand in the neighborhoods themselves. And of course, we ate together a lot, and of course, it was New Orleans, and so after a certain hour, I didn't want to know exactly what was going on. So these are just some of the images of our students there gutting homes. This was in January because it was a fall course. And what I want to say is that what happened for the students in these moments is that these students who did not necessarily know each other from sitting next to each other in the classroom, who had engaged but always very carefully around Katrina. By the way, also we had 3 Katrina survivors in the classroom, 2 of whom were white women and 1 of whom was a black woman. and the two white women had pretty positive recovery experiences, certainly terrible losses, but also recovery. The African-American woman in our classroom had not recovered. Her home was still not rebuilt. Her family was still living in diaspora across the U.S. And so there was always in the classroom this kind of anxiety about walking around the survivors, right? Sort of coping with the questions of the survivors in the classroom while simultaneously trying to have these tough questions answered about race. And when we actually ended up there together, suddenly and amazingly and very quickly, all of these barriers begin to fall down between race, between gender, between survivors and non-survivors, between recovered survivors and those who were still suffering. So just quickly, fundamentally the lessons that the students learned was scope versus specificity. When we were in the classroom, we learned everything about Katrina, right? We had, again, I still think we're the group of 100 people who maybe know the most about it beyond the folks living in New Orleans themselves, right? We had a sense of the scope of the disaster. But when we ended up on the ground in New Orleans, we learned about the specificity of the disaster. So it's 300,000 homes until you're standing there, and then it's this house, and it's this house, and it's this house. And the students would spend 8 hours gutting a home. They would feel such a great sense of accomplishment having finished it. They would walk out, look down the block, and see a mile of more homes to be done. So they felt both the scope and the specificity. We talked about structures versus humanity. So we had talked in the classroom about everything that was operating against the capacity of people to return to New Orleans. And then we get to New Orleans and guess what? The people are returning. And they're standing there fighting against every single one of these structures, which we had already talked about were in certain ways insurmountable. So the students experienced, right, both the realities of the structural implications of something like a disaster like Katrina, but also the deep humanity of people capable of and willing to fight back against those structures. Choice and community. We talked so much about choosing to come back. Who would choose to come back? And yet when you actually see the neighborhoods with one house rebuilt here, and then 4 that aren't, and then 1 that's rebuilt, and then 1 that's gutted but not rebuilt, you realize that these choices are all made within the context of collectives. And finally, I think we learned that what is possible may be much more than what we think is possible, both in the context of our classroom, that we did much more in our classroom than we thought was possible, but also in the context of Katrina. Now, it turns out that this was really still not enough for the students, right? So they had taken this class, they'd gone down and done their service learning project, but at this point, they realized that what they really wanted to be was advocates for change. So what the students did was to launch the Got Guts campaign. And this was completely their decision and their creation, and they decided that having learned what they had learned in the classroom, they should have been policy experts. And yet, when they got on the ground in New Orleans, they learned so much more. And so they said, you know what? No one in government should be making policy until they go and gut one house. Now, their point was, we don't care whether you make conservative policy or liberal policy, left policy or right policy, Democratic policy or Republican policy. Maybe they did care, but this was not advocacy in that sense. It was a challenge where they said, if you've got the guts, if you, any policymaker in the country who's making policy about Katrina, should gut at least one home. And so they launched WeGotGuts.com. Let's see if I can pull that up for you here. And this is their website. And you can go there, you can buy t-shirts that have this emblem. They then use the money from those t-shirt sales to send other groups of students from less well-resourced universities than less well-privileged than Princeton, down to, so other New Jersey institutions that have fewer resources, they actually use the money from the t-shirt sales to send other students. You can go on there and get a letter to download and issue to your elected official, challenging them to go down and gut at least one home. They've got all of their media coverage here on the site where they did some NPR stories and local news stories. And so the Got Guts group is now, 2 years later, still going to New Orleans, still sending others, and still trying to challenge elected and appointed officials before making policy in New Orleans to go down and gut homes. Okay, so just very quickly, I want to show you just a bit about the Introduction to African American Politics course. Again, I'm teaching this course in the context of the first viable African American candidate running for the Democratic nomination for the U.S. presidency. This is, again, a very standard course. It's an intro course. Here's how African American politics is done. And again, we decided that in this class, if we just did midterms, exams, finals, and papers, that the students, although they would learn something, would also miss something fundamental about the workings of African American politics. So what we did was to work with a Princeton alum, and I have to say one of the amazing things that I have learned is to use my alum, because alum graduate and go off and they do all of these shocking, fabulous, wonderful things. They often want to give back to their universities, but aren't quite sure how. So we went out and found this brilliant alum who works at ABC News as a film editor. And he came in, Mel McCrae, and taught the students how to use documentary film equipment. Nearly 50 students in this class of 75 students took the challenge to, instead of doing a final exam, instead of doing a midterm exam, they did still write 2 papers, but instead of doing their exams, what the students did was they created film projects. And Mr. McCrae would come on Saturdays and train them all day about both how to use the film equipment as well as how to use Final Cut Pro. And the kids became specialists in how to create short films. And they created films that were sort of 3 things. One, they put together a Spike Lee Film Festival during our January break time. So when the students first come back, we have this weird schedule. They come back, they take their exams. So during that reading period, they did a film festival of Spike Lee films. They invited all of these people from the community, and they talked about questions of race and American politics through the context of Spike Lee's films. Again, stories that they know, but in a very different way. They also put together 2 news magazine stories about questions of race on Princeton's campus. One was about charter schools versus public schools as a route to elite universities. And the other one was about this big thing that kind of touched off on campus about animal rights versus human rights. The Princeton Animal Welfare Society had done a event where they were using language of slavery and genocide to talk about meat eating, and the African American and Latino students on campus went ballistic. So they actually did a news magazine story about the different sides of the story. And then they also did first-person profiles of individuals in contemporary American politics. Now, because we're close to New York, they got great folks. They got Cory Booker. They got Nelson George. They got Ben Chavis, Kevin Powell. It was real. It turns out, the students they call, they say, we're doing a class project here, and these folks were willing to say yes to them. So again, in our film festival, they watched Do the Right Thing, 4 Little Girls, and Crooklyn. In our news magazine stories, and then again, they did, here are the folks that they had for their first person profiles. Now I do have a clip, but we're a little bit over time here, so I'm not gonna show the clip of their film, although I'd be happy to do it at some other point. But again, what did we learn by standing up and getting outside of class, doing a project together, right? Was we learned something about how difficult it is to make media representations of the politics stories that you care about. We learned about the art of visual storytelling within a context of stories about politics. And we really made a product, right? The students have DVDs that they can walk around with, that they can show, that we have now linked up to a website, right? So that the students themselves have something that is tangible, right, about their experience of learning about race. So what we really learned in both classes is that we learned how to work together on common projects, even when we often disagreed with one another. We learned that interracial talking and understanding came in the context of shared goals, much more so than in the context of simply learning in a classroom. And we learned that the impossibility of the tasks actually pulls students together in important ways. Everything that these students did was impossible. Anyone who's ever pledged a sorority or fraternity understands the value of hazing for creating collective groups. You should not haze, it's very bad. There should be no alcohol involved. But the impossibility of tasks, asking students to do something that is far beyond, right, their sort of normal classroom experience, caused them in many ways to have to rely on each other. So it's not possible to call up Vernon Jordan and put together in 10 weeks, a high quality, broadcast quality. That's not possible, but I've got one right here in my DVD player. So they did these impossible things, and in so doing them together and doing them in interracial groups, they started to form the common vocabulary for having conversations about race. Again, I'm not going to show that, but I will show you just quickly that we're continuing with this moving beyond the classroom. If you're at all interested, today on theroot.com, I don't know if you read The Root. The Root is a great website. You should read The Root. If you go to theroot.com, you'll see that I have a story there today about lessons from New Orleans from our most recent trip. This is a class on environmental justice that I'm teaching this semester, and we just went to New Orleans on an environmental justice trip, a very different trip than our home gutting trip. And I talk here, and particularly the students do. So I have sort of the first half of the essay, but the whole second half of the essay is the students themselves talking about their experiences in New Orleans and what they learned about race. And it's an interracial group of students having this conversation. So if you're at all interested in how we're kind of continuing to do this work, I encourage you to spend some time on the, plus just read The Root every day because it's just great anyway. So, and lots of good resources there for the classroom. So thank you so much.